Mercenaries versus military in Minecraft. Minecraft PvP, an incredibly common and recognizable phrase. Since the game's development began, we have seen countless PvP styles evolve over time. Many players still cling to older systems, while newer alternatives continue to emerge. But in some unique history-making servers, it becomes organized warfare, turning into highly specialized systems. Let's explore these systems and the journey of Minecraft PvP. The old 1.8 spam click PvP system is probably the first major style most people think of. Famous players on servers like Hypixel still use this system today in Skywars and Bed Wars, relying heavily on spacing, movement and fast reactions to secure victories. Mechanical skill and sudden aggressive fights dominated the scene. Then came the introduction of shields and attack cooldowns, transforming PvP into a more strategic combination of shields, swords and axes. Even the famous fight between Technoblade and Dream showcased these systems. Strategy and dedication became the path to victory. At even higher levels of play, traps and potions elevated the combat further. Hence nearly immortal enchanted armor sets, strength and speed potions became the breakthrough tools players relied on. Players overcame each other through methods, preparation and layered mechanics. Eventually, these traps evolved into today's dominant combat style, Crystal PvP. Using the highest tier gear possible, players attempt to secure victory as quickly as they can, or trap their opponent in setups that instantly kills them, or slowly guarantee their death. This is where Minecraft PvP stands today. Fast inventory management, mechanical precision, and brutally efficient tactics bringing the fruits of victory. Why am I talking about this? After all, the title of this video is Mercenaries versus Military in Minecraft. I felt it was important to explain all of this because these systems are already familiar to most Minecraft players. You and your friends probably PvP on servers yourselves, together, alone or against each other, each with different skill sets and experiences. But there is one environment that pushes PvP to another level entirely: world building and Minecraft history writing servers. Suddenly, PvP becomes organized warfare. Carefully planned battles, large-scale wars between communities and nations. We have seen this in civilization events or servers like 2b2t and on other servers where I personally play and spent years playing, stoneworks. So what makes PvP here different from a regular survival multiplayer server? Because long-term wars create communities, and these communities cannot rely on temporary random players joining battles. Reputation and skills are constantly at stake. On servers built around long-lasting nations and communities, it isn't enough for a random Steve or Alex skin to simply grab armor and fight. Detailed planning, established metas, and cooperation become the keys to victory. Without those things, you are simply a chaotic mob, one that may occasionally succeed but more often ends in an obvious defeat. Because of this, entirely new systems evolved on these servers. Military organizations with leaders, shot callers, training regiments, and secret tactics. In this video, I divide them into three categories: mercenaries, militaries, and paramilitaries. I will also use several examples from Stoneworks Minecraft, and where all of these groups either existed or still exist today. The easiest way to understand these systems is through something that almost resembles a political spectrum. Political? What do I mean by that? To understand the differences between these three systems, we first need to understand how wars actually function on history-writing servers like Stoneworks. At its core, everything revolves around in-game value. This can be currency, resources, or rare items. On Stoneworks, for example, nations use an in-game currency system. If a nation doesn't want to invest time into influencing and organizing the people fighting for it, then it simply needs more money. With enough money, it can hire mercenaries, the highly skilled players who fight for a nation during a battle, a war, or until somebody offers them a better contract. Of course, betraying contracts can damage your reputation as a merc. The opposite approach appears when a nation values loyalty more than convenience. Instead of paying outsiders, it invests time into training and organizing its own fighters. Money is spent on armor, weapons, and logistics, while players are trained into proper soldiers. This is where militaries and armies come into play. These organizations permanently fight for the nation they belong to. Between these two systems stand the paramilitaries, groups that serve a nation while still taking occasionally outside contracts for profit. Mercenaries. On servers where wars and conflicts last for long periods of time, there are moments when you simply don't have time to build an army. You need a fast, precise, highly skilled fighting force. That is where mercenaries come in. These are usually players with their own equipment, constantly practice skill sets, and some of the strongest PvPers on the server. They naturally gather into groups that satisfy one shared desire, the constant dopamine rush of Minecraft PvP. They do not need to wait for their nation to be attacked or for politics to create conflict. Whoever pays them gets their service, and between contracts, they practice. The server I personally played on Stoneworks MC had many mercenary communities. I'll use 2 examples to demonstrate how these groups generally functioned. The Brotherhood of Ulfaeng. Ulfaeng was a notorious community that frequently fought both for money and personal grudges, quickly becoming infamous across the server. Most of its members were frustrated players who had grown tired of political systems and its mechanics. Eventually, they founded a small puppet nation called Aikyeli to support their operations. To put their influence into perspective, they accumulated so much wealth and achieved so many sudden victories that they appeared in nearly every major conflict on the server. Their presence became so overwhelming that even the server staff viewed them as a serious threat. To remain integrated within the server's roleplay environment, they developed their own lore and religion. They fought under the image of Ulfaeng, the harbinger of the root, a mystical war figure. They maintained a public hierarchy inspired by Nordic and Viking structures. Their warriors were called Huskars, led by Fjarls, and the organization operated through a pirate-like top-down democracy. Most of their famous fighters sat within a high council. Ulfaeng was expensive to hire. The best fighters always are, but they delivered results. Some of their players could jump alone into groups of enemies and still survive. For them, it was endless entertainment. For everyone else, it was terrifying. Eventually, many nations stopped hiring them entirely and instead paid them simply to stay out of wars. The Hands. Originally founded as the Chancellor's Hands, this organization began as a paramilitary force before slowly evolving into a mercenary group. Unlike Ulfaeng, their roots came from deeply integrated elite fighters within the Stoneworks nation of Bardonia. They originally served as a Chancellor's personal elite. As high-tier PvP became increasingly dominant across the server, the Hands gradually shifted towards mercenary work. Because of their strong political and world-building background, they still cared about maintaining their nation and influence. Many of their members were not even primarily PvPers, but rather politicians, role-players and lore-focused players. Over time, however, they became increasingly available for hire, treating wars as both practice and a way to flex their reputation. Unfortunately, this mixed environment also dragged them into controversy. These became associated with parts of the group. This is often the price of mixing deeply ideological roleplay with dopamine-fueled constant PvP competition. Eventually, these controversies contributed to the group slowly falling apart. Together, these 2 examples represent most mercenary communities, either pure obsession with PvP and constant paid combat, or organic roleplay groups that gradually transform into combat-focused organizations. Militaries. So what happens when a nation actually wants to invest time into building an army? Then you find yourself on the opposite side of the spectrum. Your nation wants control and influence over the people fighting for it. Long term, this can become financially cheaper, but it introduces entirely different problems. Soldiers see less actions. They practice less frequently. Dedication becomes inconsistent. The nation itself must provide equipment, pay for logistics, and constantly adapt to new metas. Minecraft allows players to craft their own gear, but equipment degradation creates another issue. Soldiers rarely want to replace expensive gear out of their own pockets, because repeated losses become demotivating. And this is where true time investment begins. You don't just need fighters, you need logistics. Grinding for equipment, organizing training sessions, building alliances, maintaining military hierarchies, and tying player loyalty to the nation itself. While it is not an impossible task, but it explains why fewer people choose this path. Those who do often experience something less focused on PvP and more focused on management and organization. Let's see a couple examples. The Simulami Imperial Grand Army. The Simulami Imperial Grand Army belonged to the Simulami Empire, a nation that originally lacked wealth but expanded heavily through world building and political storytelling. Because they could not consistently afford mercenaries and because their gameplay involved less constant combat, many paramilitary groups ignored them. Eventually, they decided to create their own military. They produced their own equipment, not always the newest meta, but reliable enough. and focused heavily on organization. They understood that against constantly practicing mercenaries, their greatest advantage would be numbers and coordination. Quantity itself could become quality. Not perfect, but good enough quality. To maintain cohesion, they introduced regiments, rank leaders, attendance systems, medals, and recognition programs. Soldiers and officers were separated into specialized training groups focused either on combat or management. Army of the Empire of Loyalist Uldarash. A strong contrast can be seen in the military of Loyalist Uldarash. In stoneworks history, Uldarash became the victim of a civil war. Loyalists followed an empress while internal conflict consumed the nation's resources. Desperate to survive, the Loyalists rapidly assembled a military structure. Like Simulami, they created regiments, war councils, and hierarchical systems. But unlike Simulami, they immediately faced logistical and morale problems. A nation trapped in civil war struggles far more than a stable state. Early defeats demoralized their militia-turned-soldiers, while political chaos consumed too much energy to properly maintain equipment and supplies. Eventually, subdivisions within the military were forced into self-sufficiency, leading to communication failures and internal chaos. The ongoing civil war created constant organizational instability, and in the end, the loyalist forces were forced to rely heavily on outside assistance. As we can see, mercenaries provide immediate success, but an enormous financial costs that require hundreds of hours of grinding simply to fund one or two battles. Stable nations can create functional militaries, but instability quickly destroys them from within. Paramilitaries. Finally, we arrive at the third category, and arguably the most sustainable system long-term, the paramilitary. These groups integrate themselves into larger nations while still maintaining independent identities. Most paramilitary groups constantly practice PvP and evolving metas because combat is still what they enjoy the most. However, unlike pure mercenaries, they also possess political structures, world-building backgrounds, and lore identities that allow them to integrate naturally into the server environment. Let's look at a few examples. Shirokaneza. Shirokaneza, a militaristic group inspired by Japanese culture. Originally, they played in relative isolation and focused primarily on history-writing PvP. However, when colonial groups began appearing nearby, they allied with neighboring communities to drive the colonists away. Together, they founded the Democratic Zamoth Union. As the union expanded, Shirokaneza increasingly identified with conflict-driven politics. Combining political influence with PvP skill, they became one of the elite forces leading Zamoth's military power. While assisting other nations, they maintained their own identity and openly remained loyal to Zamoth. This created an interesting balance. They generated wealth for the nation while simultaneously satisfying their desire for constant PvP. Other nations often allied with Zamoth, specifically to gain indirect access to Shirokaneza's fighters, while others simply paid them directly. Their strength came from hierarchy and an extremely close-knit community. They rarely accepted outsiders, but their love for PvP and server-wide history building allowed them to thrive almost everywhere. Vinovia. Vinovia emerged from a different background. While they also enjoyed creating history, their primary goal was building a militarized expansionist nation through world building and lore. The reason they cannot simply be called a normal military comes back to mercenary warfare. Expanding under the name Horde, they became one of the largest nations on the server. Their constant expansion created endless wars, battles, and reputation. And they capitalized on that reputation. Serving other nations for profit, Vinovia sent some of the best PvPers on the servers under their calm leadership structure. Many mercenaries joined Vinovia because it offered the perfect balance. They never had to wait for contracts, nor fear a lack of action. At the top stood a tightly connected oligarchic friend group controlling a nation built around permanent conflict and a profitable warfare. So, ultimately, the primary difference between mercenaries, militaries, and paramilitaries comes down to three things: money, PvP, and politics. Players who primarily sought combat, action, and constant excitement became mercenaries. Players who wanted to solve conflicts internally through loyalty, ideology, and organization invested into militaries. And somewhere between the two emerged a child of both systems: paramilitary nations and communities that embrace both political identity and constant warfare. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more content, form your own nations and civilizations, at play.stoneworks.gg.